So yeah, so the question is, if a trainee comes to you and you refer them to articles written by some of our starting strength coaches like Jordan or like Andy, is that okay? And the answer is yes. We have this pesky thing called the First Amendment, and it allows you to do things like write books and articles on stuff, right? And the government can't tell you no on that. So if that's out in the public domain, there's nothing wrong with referring to them. You could also, you could refer them to books. You could even write a book if you want and give copies of the book. Because you can't, if there's one thing the First Amendment was intended to prevent, it's banning books. I mean, that's one thing that really drives courts crazy. So, yeah, there's no problem with referral at all, and I think the very safe approach is to do exactly that. If they're asking specific nutrition questions and you don't get any sort of financial benefit from answering those, you can't be held liable for something you don't do, right?
So even if the person asks and says, look, I just got diagnosed, I'm pre-diabetic, and you say, hey, go watch Sully's Iron Age resistance training thing, you're still...
Yeah. Yeah, and I would precede it with, just so you know, I can't give you that kind of information. I do have a colleague who has given a very helpful presentation on the type of things you can consider when you talk to your doctor, whose advice you should follow in all circumstances. I'm good at the CYA thing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I may do an update at some point, because I think that the article I wrote back in 2014 is starting to get a little bit dated. So I may, at some point in the near future, when I have time, I may do an updated version and maybe make it sort of more generally applicable. I mean, the wonders with modern technology is anything I write can be disseminated pretty widely without me doing anything. So it's, but yeah, no, I don't know. It's the dietetics articles out there I found are not usually very helpful, except for mine. I think that's a pretty damn good article, but I'm sorry. Yeah, well, Rip and I are gonna have to compete for who's the best. So AEDs, right? Why am I covering this? Well, two reasons. Number one is that there are 12 states that have AED laws and very specific requirements. So take a look. If you are in one of these states, then you probably, if you don't have an AED or you don't know what your requirements are for it, it would probably be a good time to check that out, like when you get back. Just to make sure. But so that's the first one, is that there are a fairly large number of starting strength coaches in all of these areas that are governed by AED laws. The other thing is, you may not be in one of these states, but you want to have an AED anyway. So what is the standard of practice, for lack of a better term, for an AED? Well, if you look at what these laws require, that'll give you a pretty good idea as to what is going to be an effective type of training, an effective type of maintenance, and an effective type of use of an AED. So this could actually, if you kind of look at these laws and glean from them, you can actually, you might be able to get something useful for it. I think I was talking to the Sokolinskis last night, and they're in Maryland, which is not one of these states, but they have an AED. They train on it. They maintain it. My guess is you probably follow the laws that are generally speaking in this one. So that's good for your liability, right? I mean, you're providing a way to prevent somebody from dying of a heart attack, which is, I mean, not just from a liability standpoint, but just, we don't want to see our trainees die. I mean, we don't. So there are a couple main issues that I want to talk about when it comes to AED laws. So the first and obvious one is, does your gym actually fall under the statute? Just because you're in a state that requires it doesn't mean that your gym necessarily falls under it, right? If a gym if it only applies to gyms with more than 100 members and you have 90, you don't fall within the law, so you don't have to worry about it. Number two, what are the maintenance requirements for an AED? How often do you have to maintain it? What kind of maintenance do you have to do? What are the training requirements? Who has to be trained? Do you have to have somebody on duty at all times? What are the procedures for the use? If somebody has a heart attack in your gym, what do you have to do? every AED state provides liability protection if you follow their law, right? So they basically say if you follow these laws, you will not be liable for use or misuse of an AED, right? But the question is, though, what kind of liability protection do you get, and what do you have to do to get it? And then the last one is, what is your penalty for noncompliance? If you are in a, if you are in a gym and you don't have one and you're supposed to, how can you be penalized? So here's my nifty table that I've tried to break down as best as I can, and I know it's a little bit hard to read for some of you in the back, but we'll go through it. So first, going to the first question, does your gym fall under the statute? Well, as you can see, we've got a kind of a hodgepodge. Some of the states don't have any minimum requirements. If it's a fitness club, you need to have an AED. But then you have Oregon, Louisiana. They both say you have to have at least 50 members for the law to apply to you. If you're under 50, you're good. Indiana, if you have at least 50 people or if you have at least 30 machines, apparently you fall under the law. I don't know what the basis for the machines were, but I mean, so basically, if you run a spinning class, then you may end up falling under Indiana, even if you have 2 people who want to spin. Illinois, more than 100, and then New York, this is not a misprint. You actually have to have at least 500 members for it to apply in New York, which means as a practical matter, very few of us, given that we charge a pretty good amount for our services and have a pretty exclusive clientele base, we're almost never going to fall with that in New York. So now, there are sometimes exemptions for types of facilities, and I'm just going to flag the issue here, but usually hotel gyms and gyms in apartment buildings don't fall under these. Usually they're specifically exempted. Educational and government facilities are exempted almost across the board, and sometimes you'll see nonprofits exempted too, like YMCAs. So, yeah, garage or home. That's a good question. It's an issue I haven't really seen anybody deal with the issue yet. So if you do a garage gym if you do a garage gym in California, I think the only thing you can really do is look at what the definition of a gym is. Usually it's pretty broad, and then just do your best. Whenever you're dealing with negligence, it is always a question of, did you act reasonably? The standard has been articulated as the reasonable, prudent person, the platonic form, to use Sully's phrase, the platonic form of the reasonable person, right? Who always acts reasonably, always does everything reasonably, is not, doesn't take too much risk, but is not too risk averse. It's just a typical person. But part of the reason why I'm covering this is, even if there's not liability protection specifically granted by the statute, if you follow these maintenance, training, and procedures requirements, it's going to be really hard for them to show that you acted negligently. And if you have a waiver on top of it, which waives, any kind of injuries for it, you're kind of doubly covered at that point.
What if you don't have one? Is there increased liability if you don't have one and you have financial wherewithal or ability to purchase one?
Yeah, so the question is, if you're in a state that doesn't require one and you don't have an AED, and then somebody dies of a heart attack in your gym, could you be held liable even if, or because you should have bought one? I haven't seen, I really haven't seen a test case on that yet that held expressly that. Yeah, it could be broad. I'm hoping we're not the test case, but it could be broad. I think the issue then comes down to, was it reasonable under the circumstances to not have an AED? If you call 911, usually that is sort of the extent of your responsibility, So, but it probably depends on the state, and it probably depends on what the facts are. I mean, if you're engaging in particularly vigorous exercise and there's a history of people having heart attacks in your gym, the court might treat that differently than if there's no history, right? So just to pick a silly example. Yeah?
I think it's worth emphasis that if you're in a state that doesn't require it, but you put it in, a lot of times people will say you assumed it due. You didn't have it legally before, but you assumed it. So if you put one in and then you don't maintain it, and 5 years later somebody has a heart attack
That is an excellent point, and it's worth emphasizing just for those who are watching this on video. If you put in an AED and you're not required to do so, you have assumed a duty that that thing will actually work, or that you have some idea of how to use it, right? So, or at least you may have acquired that duty as a result of it. So don't just put one in there to be for show. I mean, if you're going to put an AED in there, actually go the whole way. Get certified. Make sure that somebody's on staff anytime that anytime there are patrons in the gym. Make sure that you maintain it properly. Make sure that you that you call 911 and that you use it to the best of your ability. So yeah, no, very, very good point. And it's don't get an AED just for the sake of getting an AED. The unstaffed exception, yeah, and it really depends. I can't really give a general rule because it really depends on the state. Some states say that if you some states say that if you have, sort of gym after hours where there's nobody on staff, as long as you're staffed through the day, and then you have a bunch of signs that give written notification as to where it is and how you use it, then you're covered. Other states say you only get the protection if there's an employee on duty. So if it happens afterwards, you waive the liability, or you waive the liability protection. Yes. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the state you're in, and I have not gone into that because in a lot of us don't really, have that kind of a situation. Usually we're like there with the trainees, but it is a good question, a fair one, and I guess I'll just answer it as it does depend on the state you're in, and I don't have a nifty little slide to do it, so therefore it's not part of the presentation. Much to Tom's chagrin. So I'm sorry. Were there any others?
Well,
yeah.
What's going on in Oregon?
I was going to get to that.
Procedures for how to use it, but you could be protected if you meet these certain requirements.
Here is, and I'll preempt this now. I was going to get to it at the end, but it might, now's as good of a time as any. Oregon's a strange law in that it requires you to have one if you have at least 50 members. It doesn't have any requirements whatsoever, but you only get liability protection if you do what is basically all this stuff. So the idea is it's a carrot. If you're going to have an AED, you don't have to do training on it. So if there's some reason why you can't do it in your business, then whatever. But you don't get any liability protection. The only way you get liability protection is by maintaining it in certain ways that are specified by the statute, maintaining, using, etc. So, Oregon, the way I would put it is it's conditionally optional. Would be the way that I would put it. So we covered the gym and whether a gym is covered or not. Now what about maintenance requirements? Now most of them require maintenance, and all of the ones that require maintenance say if you follow the manufacturer's guidelines you're okay. So some also say you can follow the guidelines of the American Heart Association or the American Red Cross. They have their own separate set of standards which are pretty close to the manufacturer, but you can follow those as well. A lot of states have notification requirements as part of maintenance. You actually have to contact your local EMS service and tell them things like what kind of AED you have, where it is, how many times you've used it, how you've maintained it, etc. And then some states require other notifications as well. It depends on the state. So Louisiana, you have to notify the Bureau of Emergency Management Services in addition to your local EMS provider. For New York, you have to notify what's called the Regional Council. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it sounds ominous. And then in Massachusetts, you actually have to notify the police as well as the EMS. So, whatever the reason is for that. But yeah, the point is follow the manufacturer's guidelines and document it, because if you don't document it, it didn't happen, right? And I think to go with Dr. Sullivan's point. So that's maintenance. What about training? Well, pretty much every state requires you to has some sort of training requirement, right? I mean, the only exception is Oregon, which we've already covered, but all of them require it. But some of them also require you to have at least one trained employee on duty during open business hours, right? And that's so, Rhode Island for the one gym that's there, Arkansas, Illinois, a lot of these states require you to have at least one employee on duty at all times. As a practical matter, depending on your business hours, it may require you to have more than one employee trained, right? If you're open for 14 hours a day for 6 days a week, you're probably not going to have the same employee through all that time, or they may get sick or something like that. So it's usually good to have just a couple folks to do that. Usually for training requirements, you have the number of employees to be trained. You also have some sort of a training course requirement. The American Heart Association, the American Red Cross almost always satisfy this requirement, CPR training, AED training. You may need to periodically ensure continued competency. Some states like California, for example, require demonstration every so often, independently of recertification, that you actually know what you're doing. And that's specified in the statute. So that's training requirements. We then have usage requirements, procedures for use, and more or less every state has it. There are 3 exceptions. But the usage requirements are actually pretty straightforward. Number one, you have to notify EMS whenever somebody has a heart attack in your gym. That's pretty common sense, right? You also have to have a written plan for procedures in many states, an actual written document that says what you're going to do in an emergency. And some states, 4 of them, California, Louisiana, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, actually require it to be approved by a physician, or at least that you consult with a physician as you're doing it. So you got to have a written plan, and you also need to make sure your employees know about that plan, because if they don't know it, then you could have some issues there. So that's usage. Liability protection. In general, if you follow the AED law, you get full liability protection, except for willful, wanton, or intentional misconduct, which, if you like, I don't know, given that the AED is more or less automatic, I'm not sure, I'm not really sure how likely it is that you would run into problems of using it really, really poorly, but, in theory, it could happen. But as long as you follow that, you will probably get liability protection. Now, there are some exceptions. Illinois, if you use it consistent with training, then you get liability protection. It doesn't require some of the other things. Same thing with Massachusetts. And then Oregon, already covered earlier, there are a whole bunch of requirements that give you liability as the carrot. The very last one is the penalties for noncompliance. And there are, oh, yeah, go ahead.
So you've got those states now. Do you see additional states enforcing or including such rules in the future?
Yeah, so question is, we got 12 states now that require AEDs. Is this something that's going to happen in the future in other states? I think the answer is yes. Yeah. I mean, it's, given as Dr. Sullivan noted, given how easy these requirements are, and that is really, I mean, $1,500 is a lot, so I'm not going to demean the cost of it, but when you think about the cost versus the benefits, that's really what is, if hypothetically you're ever in front of a jury, that's going to be the decision they're making, is, did you skimp out on the $1,500 and then cause this person to die? So, but yeah, I think it's realistic that at least in my lifetime, we're going to see almost every state have a requirement, something like this. Now, penalties for noncompliance, there are 4 I'm going to cover. One is often a violation is a criminal misdemeanor. Not true across the board. Illinois, it's purely administrative, and in Michigan and New York, it's purely civil liability. There's no criminal liability, but a lot of this is they consider it a misdemeanor. There are also fines, and fines are all across the board. The lowest one is Louisiana, which is $100 to for your second offense, it's between $100 and $150 for a fine, and if you do a third or more, then it's between $150 and $200. not that bad, versus New York and Massachusetts, where it's up to $2,500 per violation, which means that, you know, it's much better to just spend the $1,500 there than it is to incur the $2,500 fine.
So is the violation not having the device?
It's
Reading the device and not having the device?
It's all of the above. It's not at least in most cases, it's not only do you have to have the device, you have to properly maintain it, you have to properly use it, you have to properly train with it. So. It depends. Usually, it's the inspectors are usually state health boards or state EMS providers. You also, some of them don't actually do inspections, but if they get a complaint, they will come in and look at it. So it depends on the state as to whether they're proactive or reactive. But usually it's some kind of local health authority that actually does the inspections. Some states, I believe New York, actually will go and inspect gyms that fall under the law. Which they know because the gyms are registered businesses. So you also have administrative penalties, which is, you know, you can go through an administrative hearing, and then in Rhode Island you can actually have your business registration revoked. So again, we would lose the one gym that's in Rhode Island. So that's all I've got for AEDs. I'm going to very briefly cover personal training licensure. It's going to be a lot shorter than in previous years because there really isn't anything this year. You all may remember that last year there was a serious question as to whether DC was going to become the first jurisdiction to require licensure for personal trainers. I think partly through our efforts and partly and largely through the efforts of CrossFit, who did a real full court press, that law is now no longer coming into effect. I have not seen any legislative proposals over the past year that really have concerned me. In fact, I don't know of any. So I think this issue may be dead for the time being. But having said that, just because it's dead now doesn't mean that somebody won't try to regulate this thing later. The U.S. Reps, which is the organization that has been pushing for licensure for personal trainers, has actually said we're no longer going to push for it. And the ACSM basically told them we need to stop doing that. I have some theories I was talking to Rip about as to why I think Supreme Court case law developments may have stopped it as well, which I'm not going to go into here. But point being, I think this issue is dead now, but we really have to be vigilant. Because especially with the paper that we saw yesterday, with that you know, we had a great panel discussion on, if that's going to become the new standard of practice, and state personal training licensure proposals require creation of a code of ethics or a set of best practices, which they basically all do, that absolute garbage could become the standard, right? It is possible. Or half squats, as taught by the ACSM, could become the standard, right? Not only does that hurt our business, that just hurts the entire state of the fitness industry. It makes the entire thing worse. So by all means, keep your ear to the ground. If you hear that there's some kind of a proposal in your state, you know, if you follow legislation or if you see a news article, then contact folks. Contact Rip, contact me, contact CrossFit, because it's much easier to stop a law from coming into effect than it is to repeal it once it's already on the books. We got lucky in DC. Because, you know, CrossFit really, they came after them hard, and you know, and then our organization had some pretty good articles on it as well. So I think we helped it, but gotta be vigilant. That's all I've got. I appreciate the really great questions and the engagement. If there are any other questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, I will take my leave, and you will no longer have the pleasure of hearing my voice.